What an honour it is to follow Susan. I have to say, as a woman who lives down here in the south, watching what's been achieved in Scotland, even if that legislation passed, watching the success of your campaigns in moving this up the agenda, the benefit that we felt in Westminster and in London and across the rest of the UK, the difference that that Scottish campaign has made to the debate has been immense. So I think we all owe you a gratitude. So I think it's very fitting that I'm last on this panel. I think this is a Women's Place UK panel emulating real life, because I'm a late adopter to this debate compared to all these women who've come before me. So it's interesting Susanna mentioned that Guardian panel, because that's the first time that I wrote about this issue. I can't even really remember what I wrote because I can't bring myself to look. It was very softly, there's a problem with prisons. But of course women can shove up and make space for men who identify as women on political shortlists. So it's a bit embarrassing. But yes, I'm a latecomer to this debate. I knew back, like Susanna, I was oblivious to this in sort of 2014, 2015, 2016. I knew I had problematic views in about 2017 when I told an ex-boyfriend that I didn't think that anybody male should be in a female prison, and got told I was transphobic. I had arguments with colleagues at work, not at the Observer, where I was told that the reason the debate is so toxic is because trans people face so much hate, and actually women just do need to be a bit nicer and more understanding about this. The way I came into writing about this in a proper way, though, was, so I work at the Observer, I write our editorial column, and I also write columns. And I feel like I'm in a very lucky, privileged position, actually, as a woman on the left with this platform to write about these issues. But the way I came to it was when my editor sort of said to me, the Keira Bell judgment has come out, and we've got to write an editorial on it, Sonia. And I was like, oh gosh, so, this is a moment where I'm going to have to sort of take this on and kind of reveal, well, not reveal personally, but kind of, let my problematic view surface. And I have to say, I read that Keira Bell judgment, and I've never looked back, because what I read was just so shocking to me in terms of what had been going on in children's healthcare, and I couldn't quite believe it. And it was from that moment on that I sort of went and read avidly, listened to lots of podcasts, everything I could get my hands on, and then I started to write about it a bit more. But I am very lucky, because I think a lot of women in this debate have faced a situation where it's been very hard to get a platform to write about it. You often hear female writers saying that they end up writing, in outlets that wouldn't be their first preference, because they simply can't get published in the outlets they would like to write for. But I'm very lucky, because my editor has always encouraged me, actually, and he's always encouraged me to write about this issue and made me feel safe in doing so, even though it can be quite scary sometimes. So I feel extremely lucky. I do think, though, that the impact as a woman that you feel on your career writing about this, I think Helen got it exactly right. The earlier you come, the more you are kind of made to suffer. So I haven't faced quite the same level of vitriol and no platforming that women like Julie and then Helen and then other women on this panel have faced. So I've been relatively lucky in that sense too. At the Observer, we do write about sex and gender, and I'm really proud to work for a newspaper that is able to platform the debate around sex and gender. Way before I got involved, we were doing some of the reporting around the Tavistock at the same time that Deb Cohen and Hannah Barnes were doing their reporting from Newsnight. We had reporters looking at this issue. We publish a range of comment on all sides of the debate. So there's myself, there's also Catherine Bennett, my colleague, who writes on these issues from a gender critical perspective, but we do also publish columns by people who take a different view, which I think is the the job of a left liberal newspaper in a world where the left is so divided on this issue. And we also, and I'm really proud of the editorial line that we've developed at The Observer with my editor's support, we first started writing about gender dysphoria and the treatment of children with gender dysphoria through that Kira Bell judgment in our editorial line. We moved on to talk about free expression and the fact that women shouldn't be losing jobs ahead of that really important verdict, the four-starter verdict. And we've since actually said more about sex and gender and single-sex spaces and the law and the fact that the law really needs clarification. So that's kind of where we are as a newspaper. Judith from Women's Place UK asked me to sort of do the taking stock. You know, we've heard the history, and I think it's incredible sort of how far this has come. But where are we now? And also kind of looking forwards, what still needs to be achieved when it comes to the press and the way that the press report issues of sex and gender. And my headline is, things are getting better, but too slowly. And I think that is true, actually, of institutions right across society, and the media isn't any different. Things are changing, but, you know, it would be great if it was a bit faster. But just in terms of what has got better, I think, and this is a very personal vantage point, other women on the panel may feel they've got, you know, different experiences, but the things that I've noticed change in the 3 years that I've been writing about this properly is first, I think the reactions have changed when you put out a column that's got a gender critical perspective in it. You know, as I said, I've never experienced the level of vitriol that Julie and Helen have online, but it's changed a lot. So when I was first doing this, there were people trying to get me kicked off charity boards, for example. Now the response is still there, but it is more muted, and I have noticed that change. I also, the other thing that I've noticed is, you know, I do a fair bit of broadcast work, and 3 years ago, this never came up on broadcast. It never came up on political programmes, it never came up on, well, it didn't really come up on daytime talk shows. That has changed a lot in the last year. I think that's partly because of Scotland. So, you know, just to give an example, Politics Live, twice in recent weeks, it just so happens I'm on the panel, and schools and guidance on gender identity has come up, conversion therapy has come up, and I've just been there as a commentator on the panel who's been able to talk about it. The same is true for This Morning, which addresses a different audience, and my experience has been that on broadcast, it's still not talked about perhaps enough, but it's talked about a lot more than it was 3 years ago. And also the thing that I've really appreciated is editors have been really robust, broadcast editors have been robust in actually defending my view, to express my opinion and to say we are an impartial broadcaster, we have a balance of views, and Sonia is very much part of that, and Sonia's views of women like Sonia is part of that balance. And I've seen that pushback happen when complaints come in, and I just don't think that would have happened 3 years ago. I think, you know, if I'd been going on broadcast saying some of the stuff that I'd said in my columns, you know, it would have been more a case of, oh, we might not invite that woman back ever again. So I think that's positive. And then I think the other thing that I've really noticed is that I'm reading a lot more stories about the issue of sex and gender. And I think there are some downsides to some of that coverage, as Helen has talked about. It's a more bifurcated coverage, and that's because I totally agree with Helen. It has become more of a culture wars issue, and while there are lots of people who care about this issue from the political spectrum for exactly the right reasons, there are definitely some people who are looking to weaponise it. So that is part of the reason why it's got more traffic. But again, I just think it's people are more conscious of it, again, partly because of Scotland and the Scottish debates. And so I'm reading many more stories about this issue relating to sport, relating to children's healthcare, relating to convictions and prisons, for example. So there are some real positives, but it is really slow. And my God, I'm sure every journalist in this room, just like every woman who talks about this issue, I'm sure we're all in agreement that it has really felt like hard work just to even get it to this point. You know, as I said, I'm somebody who's sort of come in catching the tail end of the wave of writers who were involved earlier, like Julie and Helen. And so I just want to reflect a bit on why it's been slow and what that means. And one other positive thing that I was going to say that I forgot was the one thing that I look at the media in other countries and I think, oh my God, thank God I'm in the UK, because although it's at times felt bad, when you look at the media in countries like Australia, Canada, Ireland, other English-speaking countries, it is far, far harder to get those issues surfaced there. So I feel like we've been lucky in that respect because we are Turf Island, of course. So why are things slow to change? And it comes back to, I think, what I was saying about media organisations. We are just a microcosm of society, and the same cultural influences that are affecting institutions right across the society, from the NHS to the police to schools, are affecting organisations and institutions in the media. And, you know, we've heard that some fantastic history, recent history, about how what is essentially quite a radical ideology and a radical set of ideas that do not have public support, they do not have public buy-in. There's now been very good polling that shows that the public is essentially moderately gender critical, live and let live, but they're not really up for gender identity replacing sex for all aspects of society. But that ideology that says that sex is irrelevant and it's all about self-ID, gender identity instead, and sex is either a feeling or a way you present, that is an ideology, and it has been incredibly powerful across institutions right across society. And I think the media is no different. And you know, to get a flavour of that, I thought the Stephen Nolan podcast series on Stonewall was excellent. And there's an episode on the BBC and there's an episode on Ofcom, and I'd really recommend listening to them. And it shows kind of, it highlights, there were lots of unanswered questions that are thrown up, partly because Ofcom didn't answer some of the questions that the journalists in question put to them. But, you know, it's very good at highlighting this grey zone where there's a diversity campaign, which is essentially gender ideology, which is this ideology around replacing gender identity with sex, and actually how that starts to become the norm, the starting point for these institutions that are supposed to be impartial. I mean, Ofcom is a regulator, yet it was part of Stonewall's diversity champion scheme and its workplace equality index. And, you know, you had the chief executive of Ofcom back in 2020 appearing to agree on a parliamentary committee with the contention that, you know, LGB Alliance is problematic and, you know, impartiality is absolutely, you know, if you're putting LGB Alliance on a bit of broadcast, well, that's like platforming a racist to, you know, balance an anti-racist. So it's been very powerful, I think, across the media. And this idea that gender ideology is the starting point and being kind is actually, this is the starting point, we don't need to debate it, and everything else is bigoted and hateful. And it has had real impact. And those impacts are sticky. They don't go away overnight. So even as you get sort of the top of institutions in the media, but elsewhere, look at the Labour Party, elsewhere, even as the top of leaders and institutions might sort of now acknowledge that there is a debate to be had, that ideology becomes very sticky just amongst the people in these institutions. And, you know, you can see that, for example, in the BBC. I think it's very interesting. I think they've been doing a lot better in some of their reporting in this issue. It's not absolutely still not perfect. But I thought there was an interesting tension highlighted by the reporting of the Andrew Miller conviction, the man who kidnapped and sexually assaulted a young girl. And the online bulletins all said, they all talked about how his trans-identifying status was an aggravating factor in the sentencing, because the judge basically acknowledged what feminists have been warning about for a very long time, which is that this is a man who used the fact that he identified as a woman to lure a girl into his car, and she would not have got into that car if he had been a man. And that was an aggregating factor in his sentencing. The BBC bulletins acknowledged that, which I thought was great. The BBC Online report made absolutely no mention of it whatsoever, and I think it shows that actually there can be pockets of different culture within institutions. So why is it's sticky? I think, first of all, these ideologies can be very quick to take root in an organisation, but quite hard to sort of kick out and overturn, and they can be very slow to unpick. And I think that's because of the cultural dynamics around how these ideologies become very prominent in institutions that are full of people who want to do the right thing, right? And they want to be kind, and they are told that this is the way to be kind. And, you know, just to give an example, this isn't an example from the media, but I think it very powerfully illustrates what has happened in so many institutions in this country. So I was speaking to a parent whose child had been socially transitioned by their school against parental wishes. And that this child had had psychological input. The psychologist was agreed that a watchful waiting approach was right. That's what the parents wanted. And the head teacher agreed, and the head teacher sent out a communication to the school saying, we're not going to, we're not going to use pronouns because it's not what the parent wants, it's not what the child's therapist want. And there were a group of 3 or 4 activist teachers in the school who basically just kind of disregarded it and bullied other members of staff into ignoring the head's direction. And I think that's such a powerful example because it's how these things work institutionally. You have a few activists who really cleave to this, and a lot of scared people basically who are just like, oh, we better do what they say. And that can be a very, very effective dynamic in tarring people who speak out as bigoted. And it happens right across society, and I think that is, it happens very, very quickly, and once it's set in, it is just so difficult to unpick. So I think that's one reason why it's sticky.
Sonia,
I think
just time-wise, if we could...
Okay, great. I'm just coming to the end, actually, so that's great. The second thing is I do think there's a generational issue on this in society, and that's obviously not to say all young people are, there's no gender-critical young people, because there are, and I know some of them. But I definitely think in the media in particular, there is a generational issue around the purpose of journalism, and there is a clash between the idea that journalism, you know, there's no such thing as perfect impartiality, of course, but, you know, strives for some ideal of impartiality and the truth versus a version of journalism that is basically campaigning and it cleaves to a value system. And obviously there aren't two extremes, there's a lot of stuff that sits in between, but I think there is a generational clash going on in journalism where younger journalists cleave more to the model of journalism as campaigning, and I don't think it's just true in gender, but I think it's felt most sharply in gender. So again, I think that's another reason why this ideology is going to be sticky. In terms of the implications, I'm coming to the end, on the so what, so the real lesson for me in this, and I've come to this in sort of the last year, is that it's not enough, so journalists feel really icky about organisational change and stuff like that, because we see our job as just going out and reporting or commentating on the world, and you just think, well, I'll just keep writing these columns, and, you know, maybe the world will see sense. And I've really come to the conclusion in the last year, it's just not enough. In society more widely and within institutions, actually change has to be lobbied for, and women need to organise because that is just the way I think that institutions run. And if you're a journalist, for example, working in an organisation, so much about what you can write, what you can report, how you report it is determined by organisational culture around policies like a style guide and pronouns, around whether you're, you know, commissioning editors think it's transphobic to think a certain view or think, you know, that there are multiple competing perspectives in the debate. So one of the real things that I've taken away from the last 3 years is it's not enough just to write columns. Like, it doesn't change the world. I mean, you guys will probably think, oh God, I can't believe Sonia ever thought that. But you really do need to think more carefully about how you convince leaders in institutions and colleagues that it isn't, you know, no debate doesn't work, and there are competing legitimate perspectives, and that's all that people want to have. And I do think interesting parallels with academia, where there's an academic freedom network being set up, and it is a bit like, God, you know, we live in a world where academics have to set up an academic freedom network to defend it. And I think we do live in a world where journalists have to press for free expression within their own organisations. And that's where we are. And I think if you don't work hard at that, as well as writing your pieces as a journalist, you end up in a world where actually these very sticky ideologies are going to be here for a really long time to stay. So I do still think that there's a lot of work to do.
Thank you.